from fan-assisted fridges with wheels to massive wing Pikes Peak Conquerors, even to sometimes just road cars which were perhaps a little too good compared to what they should be, Gran Turismo's had some very OP vehicles. And much in the same way as the two-part discussions which I did last year for things such as our favourite circuits in Gran Turismo and our favourite cars in Gran Turismo, I wanted to this time slightly change the topic. Not what are your favourites, but what do you think the most OP vehicles are from all of Gran Turismo's history? And for those unfamiliar with the term, OP simply means overpowered. It can apply to a game character, a movie character, a car. It's just a vehicle which seems almost too good for either what it should be versus real life or for its particular circumstance. So let's say for example you had 10 cars that all had 100 horsepower, but for some inexplicable reason one of them can do 1,000 miles an hour. That would be like the nth degree of OP. I'm going to run through 15 which I think are really prime candidates for being the most OP cars in the series, and of course if you think there are some that I have missed or whatever your personal choice would be, that of course is where the conversation comes in, and then when we revisit this video, perhaps next week or we'll have to see, we will go through the ones which you believed collectively were the most OP vehicles in the series. First up, we've got to start there because for many of you it's probably the car that you'll choose, the Suzuki Escudo. It's so consistently ridiculously OP in every single game that it's featured in, aside from, ironically, GT7. GT7, with its much more focus on realism and much more grounded cars, sometimes too much in terms of what you can tune them to, it's a bit neutered compared to what it was before. The turbo sluggishness on the Escudo doesn't feel as good in GT7 as it used to be. In GT6 and everything before that, it was a beast. The further back you go, the more powerful it gets, doing crazy wheelies. It could take on basically everything in its path, and as long as you could have it in the race at all, it was a pretty sure bet that it was going to win. Next up, another one which I think many of you will choose, and if I were going to choose one vehicle from the entire series, I think it might actually be this one, the Tomicara ZZ2. The initial form that we had back in Gran Turismo 2 looked wildly different to all of the ones after, and is still my favourite version of it, but every inclusion of the car after that point was just ridiculous, way over the top, so cheap, so fast, an absolute beast of a car with four-wheel drive, a 60 grand price tag, and LMP car performance, both in a straight line and sometimes through corners as well. The next one is easily the newest inclusion on the list, and one which I actually quote to people as saying it's essentially the new Tomicara, the Aston Martin Valkyrie. It is essentially the next quickest thing to an actual race car in Gran Turismo 7, and any game in future which has this in the Gran Turismo series, it is bound to be a fan favourite. Yes, it's way more expensive than the Tomicara, but it's worth every credit, and you can just dominate every single event which it's allowed into. Next up, we have a couple of cars which are, again, obvious picks. All 15 you could say are fairly obvious, but these perhaps more than, well, any other road car, that's for sure. First up, the R34 Skyline. If there were a single car to just be the Gran Turismo series, you could probably say it would be a Skyline in a general sense, but the R34 perhaps is the pinnacle of that. It would have to be either an R34 or probably an R32 if you're going to just talk Skylines at least. It's such a ridiculously OP car in every single game, up to and including now. It's, of course, the car that many people have purchased in real life because of loving Gran Turismo as a kid. And following directly on from that, how can you talk about an R34 without talking about the car that took up the baton from it, the R35? Perhaps even more OP in its own way, because the R34 was fantastic, but you knew its limits. You wouldn't, for example, try and beat maybe an Escudo or a Chaparral or a Pescarolo with an R34. You probably could under the right circumstances, but most players wouldn't bother. With an R35, well, you kinda can. It would take on basically anything, race and road, to the point where it gets kind of ridiculous in some of its inclusions, such as, for example, the Nismo. The next one, of course, is a fan favourite for me. I would love to say it's my number one on the list, but I can't honestly put it above the Tomicara. It is, especially when you factor in its age, a ridiculously OP vehicle, and kind of one of the most accurate occasions to be OP on the list. The Chaparral, the 2J fan car. I referenced it in the opening of the video. This is just a ridiculous machine. In real life, it was plagued with problems in terms of reliability, never actually won a race, which of course the Brabham fan car, which came after, actually did manage to do that. Even so, this thing was ridiculously quick, fairly horrific to drive because of the fans cutting out, and then you'd have virtually no grip, but in the game you don't have to worry about any of that, and it's such a beast of a car. It's still OP, even in GT7, being so pared back. In fact, you could say it's better than ever, because you can now swap out the gearbox, but in every game from GT6 back, so basically GT4 to GT6, as soon as this thing dropped, it just completely dominated. And I can already hear some of you saying at the end of this list, where was the Toyota 7? Well, spoiler alert, it's not here for me. Yes, it is, categorically speaking, overpowered in the literal sense, 1200 horses or so in like a 600 kilo frame, but the reason why I didn't include that car is because as literally overpowered as it feels, I don't feel it was quite as dominating as the Chaparral. It could be, but it just didn't come naturally as it did with the Chaparral. I could see people disagreeing with that though, so if you include it, then I wouldn't necessarily argue against it. The next one though, unsurprisingly, is also a Japanese vehicle, as many of the OP cars seem to be, the Nissan R390. This one had a very interesting arc though over the years. Up until GT4, it was basically unbeatable in its own way, but then once the other new faces, your Sauber C9s, your Pescarolos, your V12 LMRs, once they started to creep in, you could see some cracks in the R390's armour start to come up, such as for example its weight, which was too high really for what it was supposed to be, but it was still a car that was capable of punching above its weight, below its weight, I guess you could technically say, and it is a consistently good car. It's just that as new and newer cars were added, it didn't feel quite like it had the edge that it used to. Even so, it could definitely still win races, and in GT2 and 3 alone, it was such an OP car that you kind of can't not have an R390 on the list. Next up, a vehicle which has again been in more recent times, a pickup of the baton, if you will, from the older era. This one, again, you could make a really strong argument for being number one, the Mazda LM55. Introduced as part of the mostly controversial Vision GT program, but probably by far the most popular and most well-received overall Vision GT, aside from maybe the Tomahawk, just because of how ridiculous that car is. Again, you could make an argument for the Tomahawk being on the list. The reason why I haven't included vehicles like the Tomahawk or the Red Bull is because I don't consider them to be OP. Again, like the Toyota 7, they are very powerful, but they're as fast as you think they would be, so that's not really overpowered. They're very restricted actually in terms of what you can use them for. These vehicles are all ones which you can use in ways that you wouldn't expect, in other words, to dominate career mode, whereas stuff like the Tommy Kyra and the Red Bull, they're too good, almost, so that you can barely use them most of the time. To get back on track though, the LM55 doesn't suffer from that. In fact, quite the opposite. You can use this thing way too much. It's so good in career mode. The combination of having, of course, that iconic rotary performance with the huge advantage of four-wheel drive in both of its forms, Group 1 and Concept. It's ridiculous. It's such an easy car to use, it's so forgiving, and yet, even for pros, you can do so much with the LM55. Next up, a car which is a bit borderline for me. I could easily argue this one into not being on the list for the same reason as the Toyota 7, but I think this one has a bit more of an edge because it actually was a force to be reckoned with in GT4, 5 and 6, the Minolta. Of course, a fan favourite, one of the cars which myself included, many of us would love to see return. The 88CV Toyota is an absolute beast. It somehow manages to eclipse even the GT1, which itself you could make an argument for being on the list. Again, you will be disappointed if you're hoping for me to have the GT1 on the list, because as crazy as that sounds, I've actually opted not to feature it because again, I don't find the GT1 to be overpowered. Because if you think about it, back in GT2 and 3, it wasn't as good as the R390, and then in GT4, 5 and 6, it's not as good as many of the other LMPs, whereas the R390 either was the best or was still pretty much on par with them. The GT1 in the later games was similar enough to still be good, but the fact that it wasn't dominant in 2 or 3 for me means I couldn't quite get it on the list. And like I said, that will probably be one of the most controversial cars not to have on the list, and I will understand if you're annoyed, much like the Toyota 7. I have at least had the Minolta though, which I think is a pretty crazy car, and unlike the GT1, and of course it punches well above its age, if nothing else, given that it's a late 80s car which looks and feels more like an early 2000s LMP, if anything. Next up, a car which will ruffle feathers and please people at the same time because it is a fan favourite, but the feathers being ruffled will be more so because I didn't include the Toyota GT1 and I did include the R390, but I felt that I had to include the Mazda 787B. Of course, the LM55 is more OP overall in the more recent games, but the 787B is on the list for the reason why the GT1 isn't, and that is to say, the Toyota has everything it needs to be the best, and yet the R390 was still better. The 787B, on the other hand, much like in real life, was an underdog. Smaller engine, less power, and yet still a Le Mans winner in real life, and in the game, even though it's a sub-1000 horsepower car in virtually all forms, it can still not only keep up with many of the other cars, sometimes with 200 or 300 horsepower disadvantages, but it can beat many of them, certainly when you use it under the right circumstances, and the fact that it can punch so well above its power, well, that is kind of the definition of OP. Next up, we've got another LMP car, this one another fan favourite. I'm kind of putting two cars together for this one because it's more of a legacy thing, and it depends which Gran Turismo game you're talking about. This was introduced in GT4, much like many of our fan favourites, and then we haven't seen it again after GT6, and I am of course referring to Pescarolo. Iconic at Le Mans, iconic driver, iconic team, and for me it comes down to two. You had the Team Peugeot, which barely anyone used, and personally I always love the look of that one. That blue and green looks stunning on that car. Then they had the PlayStation livery, as I used to call it, the ice cream Well, that was a fantastic car in GT4, basically dominated everything. And then in GT6, or around GT5 or 6, I don't recall now, we had the addition of the hybrid. The hybrid took things up to 11. Crazy power, and everything that was already good about the other two, it made even better, to the point where it was basically the choice for the majority of players when it came to seasonal time trials and actual racing events as well. Such a ridiculously good car. Ironically, I wasn't a huge fan of it myself because everyone used it, so of course I wasn't. This again is one of the probably Mount Rushmore definitions of an OP car in Gran Turismo's history. And for the record, I am, as I said, kind of combining the PlayStation version, which was dominant in GT4, and then of course the hybrid version, which dominated later on, kind of as that overlap period. The next three are all vehicles which are more so like a range of cars, which I know is a bit of a cheat to say, and the reason why I've done that is because although many will disagree on which particular version you find to be the most OP and in which particular game you find it to be the most, I think most of us could agree that the next two, as well as being rivals to each other, are both very, very OP, particularly for road cars, sometimes even when it comes to literally starting the game. And first up, that is of course the Mitsubishi Evo. Kind of like how I said the R34 Skyline, that encompasses a lot of different variations technically, likewise with the Evo, except way more. You could include rally versions, road versions, everything from an Evo 1 up to an Evo 10 and everything in between. To me, the Evo is such a consistently OP car, and specifically in the lower level to stuff like an R34 Skyline. Yes, you could take on a Skyline, but the Evo really comes into its own in that kind of low to mid-range road car territory. 200, 300 horsepower, and then anything above that it can do, but it's the lower level stuff where it really feels like it's far too good. And of course, to follow on, pretty much has to be the Subaru Impreza, for the exact same reasons. Depending on which game you choose, which version you choose, rally car, road car, wagon, coupe, 22B, whichever one, they're so consistently OP in the exact same ways. The next one is also kind of a range, and I could feel some people being annoyed that this one does make the list, but something like the Toyota GT1 or the Toyota 7 doesn't, so if that's how you feel, then I wouldn't necessarily say that I don't understand, but for me, I have to consider what this car, what this range can do over the entire series, especially for a road car, but also including racing versions, how OP this car has always been, how iconic it's always been for being OP, and it's the Dodge Viper. It's such an iconic car for Gran Turismo, but it's always a good one. It's incredibly quick in a straight line, way better through corners than you would ever think it could be, especially in the later games with the advent of stuff like the ACR. In fact, the Viper ACR in Gran Turismo 6, if I recall correctly, I think was, if not the highest point level of any road car in the game, maybe number 2. It was like up there with the Nissan GTR as well, which is insane, especially for a rear-wheel drive car, comparing it to all-wheel drive rivals like the Tommy Kyra and the GTR. And of course in the racing world, stuff like the blue and white Team Orica, the red with tinted lights Team Orica later on, and even now, stuff like the Group 4 and Group 3 Vipers, they're just always such a solid choice throughout the entire series and the entire range of Vipers, and I would argue, this could be controversial, but I would argue it's more OP than the Corvette has been. The Viper is pretty damn OP in every single game. And the last one on the list will almost seem to exist just to spite God if God were the Toyota GT1, and this is one of those where if you weren't there you won't get it, but if you played the games at the time you'll immediately go, oh yeah, of course, that has to be on the list. Kind of one of those OP cars that you can forget was as OP as it was. The Suzuki GSX-R4. We started the list with the Suzuki and we're ending with one as well because this was such a ridiculously OP car that it was the go-to choice in virtually every single time trial seasonal event in every Gran Turismo game where you have seasonal events. So particularly in 6, I would imagine in 5 as well. I didn't use the car as much, but it was certainly in there. GT4, it's just such a ridiculously good sports car. It's of course motorcycle powered, as the Gixxer name implies, but it's kind of like a baby version of what the Tommy Kyra can do. It just feels way too good for what it should be, and you can argue back and forth all day long on whether or not it should be that good, but the fact is, it was ridiculously fast. And to go back to my example, as ridiculous as it was, of 100 horsepower cars and one doing 1,000 miles an hour, this is possibly the best definition of that, because this kind of had like really low level points and really low level power, but it could just destroy anything in its path. And of course, if you disagree, well, that's the point. That's where you come in. What do you think the single most OP car is? Or if you want to expand it, what would your top 5, top 10, maybe even top 15 like I've done, list be? It could be a car that you found to be OP in one game. It could be the entire franchise. I mean, it's hard to beat the R34 or R35 if you're talking about the legacy. But then again, you could say the same thing about the Viper. It's definitely an argument that could go back and forth. And as much as we have our personal favourites, you do have to be a bit more objective about this one. For me, for example, of course, I'd never have a Subaru Impreza on my personal favourites list, but I do think it's one of the most OP cars in the series. And of course, stick around on the channel because in the near future, we will revisit this in part 2 you to put together what your collective thoughts were and which cars really came through the most in the community side of things. So I'll see you then, and for now, thanks for watching.